Hey guys, I'm Ava, and let's talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! Today we're going to be looking at a very cool deck. This deck is absolutely perfect for when you can't decide what strategy you want to play. We are running 3 different engines in this deck, but it is also a great budget deck. This gives you a great bang for your buck, and this deck is fairly competitive and should definitely at least take you pretty far in your locals. And let's get right into this deck. We are playing Shaddoll, Invoked, Dogmatika. So this deck will be focused on those 3 archetypes, and let's get right into this deck. So this deck focuses on fusion summoning monsters from the extra deck and also limiting your opponent's ability to special summon. So the first card in our deck is going to be Alistair the Invoker. He is one of the most important cards in the deck as the entire Invoked engine revolves around him. So he has 2 effects. The first one is that you can discard him to have one of your fusion monsters gain 1,000 attack and defense, which isn't super important. His more important ability is his second ability, which is that if he is normal summoned or flipped face up, you can add an invocation spell from your deck to your hand. Invocation is going to be one of the most important spell cards in this deck. It acts as our polymerization for our invoked fusion monsters. So Invocation allows you to use cards from your hand to fusion summon a monster, and in particular, if the monster is an invoked monster, you can also banish monsters from the field or either player's graveyard as fusion material. So that means that you can use your opponent's monsters in their graveyard as fusion material, which is also part of what makes this deck so great. You're limiting your opponent's options, and this deck has other options in it later that are going to let you send cards from their extra deck to the graveyard, which when used in conjunction with this is really powerful because you're able to banish a lot of their cards from their extra deck, which is really great. This card has another effect that when it's in the graveyard, you can use its effect to target one of your banished Alistairs, so you banish it when you are using this to fusion summon, and you can shuffle Invocation back into the deck and add Alistair to your hand. So that is a really great way to recycle this engine. Next up, we are also running Eldritch the Golden Lord. So this might seem like a random addition to this because it is a one-off random card, but it's actually really powerful within the context of this deck. So you can send this card and a spell or trap from your hand to the graveyard and target one card on the field and send it to the graveyard. This is really useful for certain types of removal, especially for things that can't be destroyed by card effects because you are simply sending it to the graveyard with this. However, this card's more useful effect in this deck is that if it is in the graveyard, you can send one spell and trap you control to the graveyard and add it to your hand. So this is going to be really useful in conjunction with Magical Meltdown. So Magical Meltdown is the field spell for this deck, and it is related to Invocation as well. So when this card is activated, you can add an Alistair the Invoker from your deck to your hand, and also it has another effect that when you are fusioning summoning a monster, your opponent cannot negate it with card effects or activate their card effects during that time, which just helps you make sure you get your fusion monsters through. But that first effect is when the card is activated, you get the Alistair. So if you have Eldritch, you can send this card to the graveyard and play a second copy of these. Normally in a deck like this, once you have a copy on the field, the others are kind of dead, but when you have Eldritch, you are able to constantly make use of those new copies and get yourself Alistair whenever you need to. So I think that is why he is such a great addition, and he's also a light monster, which is definitely useful in this deck. Next up, we have Dogmatika Maximus. This is a really useful card. It isn't quite as good as it used to be just because people are so aware of this strategy now, and I think people are preparing for it. Basically, you can banish an extra deck monster from your graveyard and special summon this card from your hand. This is going to be really great because we are playing a deck that focuses on sending cards to the graveyard, including extra deck monsters, so there should always be something there for you to target. And also, during your main phase, you can send 2 monsters from your extra deck to the graveyard, and your opponent also has to do the same. They have to send 2 monsters from their extra deck to the graveyard. This is a really great effect because, one, it works for us. We have certain cards in our extra deck that are going to allow us to activate their effects when they are sent to the graveyard, and of course it hurts our opponent as well. Just to note, this does have a special summoning restriction for the rest of the turn after you use it, so do be mindful of that. Next up, we have Fleur de Lis. So this is another Dogmatika card, and this one is really great in this deck. when you have a special summoned monster from the extra deck on the field, you can special summon this card from your hand, and if you control another Dogmatika monster, you can negate the effects of one face-up monster on the field until the end of the turn. And also, if a Dogmatika monster you control attacks, you can have all of your Dogmatika monsters gain 500 attack and defense, which is a really great effect, but that middle one where we can negate an effect is really important in this deck. One of our win conditions is actually El Shaddoll Winda, which has the ability that each player can only special summon monsters once per turn while this card is on the field, which is a really great effect. It's such a good floodgate, especially if you're playing against something like Heroes, but sometimes you don't want that special summoning restriction. So if you are playing Fleur-de-Lis, you can get around that because you can negate its effects for one turn, aka your turn, and you can special summon as much as you want, and then its effect reactivates the next turn and your opponent is still screwed. So I think that is why Fleur-de-Lis is such a great card in this deck. Next up, we are also running 2 copies of Ecclesia. Ecclesia is a great card. I love this card. It's so beautiful, and it's gotten a lot cheaper since it has been reprinted. This card cannot be destroyed by battle with a special summon monster, and it has a few more effects. So if a monster special summon from the extra deck is on the field, you can special summon this card from your hand, and if it is normal or special summon, you can search yourself a Dogmatika card, which is a really great effect. And again, the same special summoning restriction applies, so be careful with Ecclesia, but this is going to be really useful. You can get yourself a Fleur-de-Lis if you need it, depending on the context, or maybe you want Dogmatika Maximus. It's still a very great card. A lot of decks will run 3 copies of this, which you could do. I'm just running 2 because I want to keep this to 40, and I thought that I wanted to include more Shaddoll cards. Speaking of which, we have Shaddoll Wendy as our first Shaddoll card. A lot of Shaddoll decks don't actually run a lot of Shaddoll monsters, really just the extra deck cards, and maybe 1 or 2, but for this deck, I actually wanted to include them because this is a Shaddoll Invoked Dogmatika deck, in that order, I would say. So we have Shaddoll Wendy. Each of these Shaddoll cards has 2 effects. They have a flip effect, and they have an effect that activates when they are sent to the graveyard by a card effect. And the reason that's so handy is because these are primarily used as fusion materials, so they are going to be sent to the graveyard for that effect. And that means that whenever you fuse, you will get these effects as well. So Shaddoll Wendy's first effect is that if you flip summon it, you can special summon a Shaddoll monster in face up or face down defense position. And also its graveyard effect is that you can special summon one in face down defense position. So we are running 2 copies of this, and this one is particularly useful because it is a win monster, and in our extra deck, we are running Invoked Ragin, which does require a wind monster, so this helps us meet that restriction. Next up, we are running Shaddoll Squamata. A lot of decks do run 2 copies of this, so feel free to. I'm just running 1. So this one, its flip effect is that you can target a monster on the field and destroy it, and its graveyard effect is that you can send 1 Shaddoll card from your deck to your graveyard, aside from this one, which is a really useful effect because you can essentially get yourself the effect of any of these when you need them, which I think is really handy. Next up, we have Shaddoll Beast. Shaddoll Beast will let us get some draw power. It lets you draw 2 cards and discard 1 if you flip it, but if you also send it by effect, it lets you draw 1 card, which is really handy. Next up, we have Shaddoll Dragon. You can target 1 card your opponent controls and return it to the hand. Again, this is a great form of removal. If your opponent is playing cards that can't be sent to the graveyard or whatever by a card effect, Shaddoll Dragon is a great way around that. And also, if it is sent to the graveyard, you can target 1 spell or trap card on the field and destroy it. Very useful. You can use it on your own or your opponent's. Next up, our second to last Shaddoll card is Shaddoll Hedgehog. So if this card is flip summoned, you can add a Shaddoll spell or trap from your deck to your hand, which is going to be very useful. We will be able to get ourselves Shaddoll Fusion, El Shaddoll Fusion, or Shaddoll Schism using that effect, which we will definitely be wanting to do. And also, if it is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can add 1 Shaddoll monster from your deck to your hand. Very useful effect as well. Next up, we have Nail Shaddoll Aerial. Its flip effect is that you can target 1 of your banished Shaddoll monsters and special summon it in face up or face down defense position. But its graveyard effect is that you can banish up to 3 cards in the graveyard, which is super useful because it is not just your graveyard. You can use this on your opponent's graveyard as well. And since we're going to be sending some of their cards to the graveyard, we can use Nail Shaddoll Aerial to make sure they don't end up using them and banish them. Then we are just running a few hand traps. We are running Psyframe Driver and Psyframe Gear Gamma, so that's going to take up 4 slots as well. And we are also running Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion and 2 copies of Effect Veiler. You can really change these around. These are really a free-for-all. Choose whichever hand traps you happen to have. If you have Ash Blossom, that would be a really great addition, but I just didn't include that because these are the more budget-friendly options that there are. You can also, if you want, remove some of the Shaddoll cards and add more hand traps. That's definitely an option. Next up, we are also running Magical Meltdown. We talked about this. This is our field spell, and it is for the Invoked engine. I don't need to talk about it again because we already did. Then we are also running Invocation, which we've already talked about as well. Next up, we are running Nadir Servant. So this is a Dogmatika card that will let us send one monster from our extra deck to the graveyard and then add one Dogmatika monster from our deck or graveyard to our hand. So that card does have to have less attack than the card we sent, but we have a few cards in the deck that are specifically for effects like this. One of which is Titaniclad, the Ash Dragon, which when sent to the graveyard lets you add a Dogmatika card from your deck to your hand, which is very useful. So if you send this card to the graveyard, it has 2500 attack, which will let you get Fleur-de-Lis if you need it. And also you can use that secondary effect to get yourselves another Dogmatika card, so you could go for Dogmatika Maximus or Ecclesia. Also, just a note on Nadir Servant, it does have a restriction on special summoning for the rest of the turn after you use this from the extra deck, so keep that in mind. Then we have our first Shaddoll spell. This is Shaddoll Fusion. It functions like a regular polymerization. However, if your opponent controls a monster that was special summoned from the extra deck, you can use monsters that are in your deck as fusion material as well. So that means you can use these Shaddoll cards that are in the deck as well, and you get the benefit of using their graveyard effects. So that is a really, really great spell card, and you can see why we are running 3 copies. Next up, we have El Shaddoll Fusion. Very confusing names, I know, but this card is a quick play spell, and it basically functions like a regular polymerization. However, it is a quick play. It only works with Shaddoll cards, but that's not really that big of a restriction, so we are including 2 copies of that. Then we are also running 2 copies of Super Polymerization, which is also a quick play spell. You can discard 1 card and then fusion summon 1 monster from the extra deck using monsters on either player's field as fusion material, and your opponent can't activate effects in response to this, so that is a really solid card. Again, discard yourself a Shaddoll card and you get their graveyard effect as well. Super handy. We are running 2 copies, as I said. And we are also running 1 copy of Terraforming, which just lets us add ourselves Magical Meltdown to the hand. Then we also have Shaddoll Schism. A lot of decks will also play Dogmatika Punishment. For this deck list, I did not include it because it has a really big summoning restriction, which is until the end of the next turn after this card resolves, you cannot special summon from the extra deck. And this is a deck that is highly, highly dependent on being able to fusion summon. So I don't think that card is necessarily worth it. You can include it for sure. You can sub out one of these Shaddoll Schisms for that, or you can replace one of your Shaddoll monsters with that. Or if you really want to save some money, you can sub out a Nadir Servant for a Dogmatika Punishment. I think removing Nadir Servant does make the deck worse. If you really want to include Dogmatika Punishment, that is one of the cards that you could substitute out. So Shaddoll Schism is a really, really powerful trap card, and I thought it'd be worth it to include 2 copies of this rather than Dogmatika Punishment to make sure we can use it. So during the main phase, you can fusion summon a Shaddoll monster from your extra deck by banishing fusion materials on the field or graveyard. It can attack directly, but also you can send to the graveyard 1 monster your opponent controls that is the same attribute of the summon monster. So our Shaddoll cards are going to be light and dark types. This is really, really great in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because a lot of good cards are light and dark attributes. So that is really, really handy. And also it's a continuous trap. So you can reuse this every single turn, which I think is really, really great. And that's why I decided to run 2 copies of this as opposed to Dogmatika Punishment, which of course you can still run if you want. So we're going to go into our extra deck, but first please subscribe if you like this video, you guys, and give this video a like. Also comment down below any other decks you'd like to see me discuss. It would really, really help me out if you guys subscribe. Alright, I will get into the extra deck now. First up, we have ourselves 2 Link 1 monsters. These cards are self-explanatory and go in pretty much any deck. We are also running Titaniclad, the Ashen Dragon. Here you could also run a Predaplant Anaconda if you would like. That card is $14 though, so this was a more budget-friendly card to fit in this slot. Predaplant Anaconda, if you didn't know, it's basically going to help you get out your Winda because it assists with the fusion monster summoning. So I added this card instead because it's like $2 as opposed to $14, but if you have that card, feel free to add it instead. Next up, we have our first Shaddoll card. This is El Shaddoll Construct, and this card requires a Shaddoll Shaddoll monster and a light monster, which we have an abundance of because we are playing Dogmatika, and also you could use Eldritch for this if you would like, and we do even have ourselves Effect Veiler or Ciphering Gear Gamma if you get really desperate. So when this card is special summoned, you can send a Shaddoll card from your deck to your graveyard, so you can choose which of those you really want the effect of at that moment. And also, if this card battles a monster at the start of the damage step, you can destroy that monster. This card also has a really handy graveyard effect, where if it is sent to the graveyard, you can target one Shaddoll spell or trap in your graveyard and add it to your hand. So this is going to be really handy if you need it with Shaddoll Schism or Shaddoll Fusion. This is why we are running 2 copies of this card in our deck, because we can definitely use this with Dogmatika Maximus or some of our other cards. Next up, we have our win condition, El Shaddoll Winda. When this card is fusion summoned, it cannot be destroyed by opponent's card effects, and also each player can only special summon once per turn while it's on the field, which is a great floodgate against heroes or other decks. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target one Shaddoll spell or trap in your graveyard and add it to your hand. So again, if you wanted with Dogmatika Maximus, you could use this card as well and get yourself a Shaddoll spell or trap. Then we are running our final Shaddoll card. This is El Shaddoll Apkaloni. I can't pronounce that name for the life of me, but when this card is fusion summoned, it cannot be destroyed by battle. And it has 2 effects that you can each only use once per turn. If this card is special summoned, you can target one face-up card on the field and negate its effects. Really, really handy. You could use this with Winda, but I do recommend Fleur de Lis over that because it is just 1 turn, which is going to be really useful for your next turn unless you are planning on winning this turn. And also, if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add a Shaddoll card from your deck or graveyard to your hand and then discard a card. So this is going to let you get whatever Shaddoll card you need, and you can discard a card. I recommend discarding a Shaddoll card because then you are able to get their effects. That's why I'm including Shaddoll cards in this deck, because I think it's actually really powerful to have those graveyard effects, and it helps make sure that you draw the cards you need. So we are also playing a few invoked fusion monsters. So first up, we have Invoked Macabre. This is going to require Alistair and a light monster. Once per turn, when a spell or trap card is activated, you can send that same type, so monster, spell, or trap, to the graveyard from your hand, and you can negate the activation, and if you do, you get to banish that card. This is definitely a very, very useful card, and it has saved me many times. Next up, we are running a card I absolutely cannot pronounce, which is Invoked Yugioh. This card requires Alistair plus a fusion monster, so you might not see this like too often, but it definitely does have a place in the deck. When this card is special summoned, or if your opponent special summons a monster, you can target one of their monsters and destroy it. Very handy. And it has another effect where you can banish one monster that is a fusion monster from your graveyard and have this card gain attack equal to that card for the rest of the turn. So that is going to be useful when we have already sent things to the graveyard. So you could use that with Titaniclad the Ashen Dragon. That would definitely work, I think. Or you could use it with some of your Shaddoll cards. I think El Shaddoll Contract would be a pretty solid option because it has 3000 attack, as would El Shaddoll Apkaloni because it has 2500. But that is just a good beefy card if you need it. We are also running Invoked Ragin. This card is definitely optional. Feel free to replace it. But it uses Alistair and a wind monster, so that is going to be Wendy. Once per turn, you can target one face-up monster on the field and change it to face-down defense position. This is really great because you can basically Book of Moon your opponent with this card. Very, very handy. And our second to last card is going to be Elder Entity and Tis. This card we are never going to summon because if you know, its summoning requirements are a Synchro monster and an XYZ monster, but that is not what is in the deck. It has a really great graveyard effect where you can target one card on the field and destroy it when this card is sent to the graveyard. Very, very useful. And our final fusion monster is going to be Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. This just requires 2 dark monsters, so that is very flexible within the context of this deck. When this card is fusion summoned, you can have a gain attack equal to one of your opponent's special summon monsters until the end of the turn, and also once per turn you can target one level 5 or higher monster your opponent controls, and until the end phase this card's name becomes that card's name and it gains that card's effect. So this is a really great card that can definitely be useful in many, many different contexts. So that has been this entire deck. As you can see, this is a pretty well-rounded deck, definitely good bang for your buck. You have a lot of different win conditions. Winda is going to be the main one, but you definitely have options and can adjust your playstyle depending on the deck you are playing against, and I think this deck just makes a really, really great Floodgate, and it's really fun to play as well because there is so much you can do, and I really enjoy the fusion summoning mechanic of it. So if you guys like this video, please subscribe to my channel and give the video a like, and comment below any recommendations you have that could make this deck list better. I would really love to hear them. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.